All right, so tonight I'm going to be reviewing another avoided deforestation project. It's another Red Plus project put out by Vera, and Vera handles pretty much all avoided deforestation projects, so you can expect that. This is called the Yacumama Forest Carbon Project. It's in basically northern Peru. You guys know that I'm pretty much only reviewing the best projects and the worst projects right now, so it's really very Shakespearean. It's either going to be a comedy or a tragedy, and we'll figure out pretty quickly which one it is. A little background. This is a project that is sponsored by an eco lodge, and it takes place on land that's owned by the eco lodge in Peru. And, a little history based on the project description. This is land that was, originally acquired a couple decades ago from the Peruvian military by this eco lodge, and they wanted to preserve the forest and turn it into a place where people could come and enjoy the forest. You can go to their website and just check out the Eco Lodge. Seems relatively nice. You can take a look on TripAdvisor and seems reasonably priced and a lot of fun, I guess. By all appearances, they appear to care a lot about the ecology and the local economy. But that doesn't mean much about the carbon itself. So let's take a look at the project. This is the project area. And if we zoom way in, this is the Eco Lodge complex. So it's 3,000 hectares, which is fairly small for an avoided deforestation project, but it would be large if it were an IFM project. One thing that we notice immediately is that it's in pretty much untouched Amazon. It's deep in the Peruvian Amazon. And another thing that we really notice immediately is that there's no road access. The satellite imagery isn't great here, but there's no road access to this project. There's road access on the other side of the river, and so the only way to access the eco lodge is by boat. The nearest road is 30 kilometers south, so that's this little town right here. Oh no, I'm sorry, this little town right here. This town doesn't have a road access either. And there's another road way up here, about 60 kilometers north. Up here. So this is immediately problematic, right? We're assessing additionality first. We want to know whether or not this project is justified. A, do we think that an eco lodge is going to clear cut its land and begin industrial timber operations? Doesn't strike me as being particularly good for ticket sales. B, do we think that it's even really financially plausible that timber operations can take place on this land, considering that they would have to come in by barge, the barge would have to work its way up this little river, and then they would have to construct a series of roads and even bridges across these streams and deal with the extensive marshland that exists on this project. For example, this is all marshland. I've skipped ahead a little bit and I've looked at the carbon numbers. And because this project is taking place in kind of lowland, marshy area, it doesn't have very much carbon on it. It doesn't have the 200 or 300 tons of carbon that we might see in other parts of the Amazon. It's only got 100 tons of biomass per hectare. What this means is that there's not very much timber on this land either, which really makes me question whether or not they could even break even, never mind make a profit, or if they could even find somebody to harvest this land. Looking around, nobody else is doing this, right? There's a little bit of deforestation along the road on the other side of the river, but I don't see anybody else, that's isolated from road access, cutting down their trees. So it makes me think that it's not plausible that this project could be in jeopardy at all. And so one of the ways that I want to assess additionality is to actually look at the deforestation maps. So let's pull them up. Again, this is Global Forest Watch maps put out there by the Hansen Lab at University of Maryland. One thing that strikes me is that, there's deforestation on this side of the river. Some of it's fairly old, so that blue deforestation is kind of older, takes place in the early 2000s, and red deforestation took place more recently, closer to 2021. And, the most deforestation that I see around the project is actually the meandering of the river, which is a natural phenomenon, of course. There's a little bit of deforestation down south. There's a little bit of deforestation in these little villages along the river. There is nothing to this scale, to the size of this project. And there's really nothing in areas that are this remote away from roads, which doesn't bode well. Now, as you guys know, what I like to do to look at whether or not a project is justified and to then look at its baseline is I like to basically put a buffer around the project and see what's happening in the project's area. So this is the buffer. I put a 25-kilometer buffer around the project area. You know, when I was at Pachama, we used much more sophisticated ways of kind of drawing up our own baseline. We would select areas that were very, very similar to the project. I think the buffer kind of gets the point across, but it's not entirely elegant. And one thing that I found kind of inelegant about this buffer was that, you know, it's basically including areas that are on the other side of the river that have a completely different development scenario because they have road access. And so what I wanted to do, and I think this is fair, I basically cropped out the buffer and removed areas on the eastern side of the western side of the river where they have access to roads. Because I don't think that necessarily it's fair to compare their deforestation rate to the project areas. So this is the buffer that I'm looking at. And I want to know what the deforestation rate is here so that we can compare it to its baseline. So I immediately plotted this out, and there is increasing deforestation. Now, most of this is because of that river. So you can see here that the meandering in the river has taken place more recently. And so it's increasing. And in fact, what you can see here is, you know, these orange areas, these are areas that have actually been intruded upon more recently than the satellite image. The satellite image dates to about 2013. So this river is moving quite fast. That is the majority of the source of this increase. But there is I suspect a little bit of this increase is actually population driven. But these numbers are very small. So I see numbers of, you know, 0.1, 0.2% per year. That means that I want to see similar numbers for their baseline. Because if their baseline is higher than this, so let's take a look at what their baseline actually is. If we go to the documentation, we can pull this up. Right. So the baseline scenario for this project is 10% per year. And the justification for this, it doesn't come from science. It doesn't come from a reference region. It just comes from the guy who owns the Eco Lodge saying that he would have cut down these trees and converted it to a palm oil plantation. And the justification, you know, it can be, they put a justification in here by pointing to a couple of palm oil plantations. These palm oil plantations are nearly 100 kilometers away to the north. So, you know, we'd have to go way up here to find these palm oil plantations. And this is about 100 kilometers away. And again, completely different scenario because there's road access. And then the other palm oil plantation that he brings up to justify this project, this one, it's way down to the south. So it's way down here. You know, I find this completely implausible. You know, first of all, these palm oil plantations are a fraction of the size of the forest that he's proposing would be turned into a palm oil plantation itself. You know, nobody's planting 3,000 hectares of palm oil here. And second of all, they have road access. So this is a completely different scenario. I'm appalled. I mean, I've never seen a Vera baseline that's so arbitrary. They're just making up numbers. So the baseline is 10%, and they claim that in 10 years, this entire project area would have been deforested, regardless of the accessibility and the profitability of the thing. I have to wonder, because this project is taking place in this region that's very lowland, floods a lot, there's a river running through it, I have to wonder if palm trees would even grow here. I'm not entirely certain. I don't think it would be profitable to get these palm trees out and like harvest them over and over again. I don't think it would be profitable to create a road network, barge these things out. We certainly don't see anybody else doing it. So their baseline is appalling. And how does it compare to what's actually happened in the project region? Well, there it is. Their baseline is 10% per year, ending at 100% this year. And that's what they said would have happened. And what's actually happened in the region is right here. We see about 1.5% of the region has been deforested, but a lot of that, again, is just the river meandering. So their baseline fails. I think their additionality fails. I don't think this project is justified at all. I don't think any of these carbon credits are valid carbon credits. It's disgusting. There's about 750,000 carbon credits being issued to this project. That's a lot. That equates to about 50,000 Americans' annual carbon output. So a small American city is being supposedly offset by this project, and that's a massive amount of pollution that is being, supposedly justified as being put into the atmosphere based on this project. The project is still on the market. It's an old project, but it gets re-verified. These credits sell for a decent amount because, it's got this eco lodge and it's got like some PR associated with it. Even though they're nonsense, anyone who's bought this project, you have still polluted. You are still responsible for the carbon that you put into its atmosphere. All right, before we get too mad, let's move on to leakage real quick. Yeah, I mean, according to this, deforestation rates have gone up since the project started in 2012. So, according to the traditional idea of geographic leakage, maybe there is leakage. Again, this is entirely based on the meandering of that river. So I don't think that any of this deforestation has anything to do with whether or not this project existed. Verification. So let's take a look at whether or not the project actually measured their forest carbon correctly. What I'm looking for here is forest inventory plots that are taken in a reasonable way to some sort of scientific standard that would tell us how much forest carbon there is. And sure enough, they do have a bunch of forest inventory plots scattered randomly throughout the project. There's a lot of transparency about how they took them and where they are. So I like to see this. And finally, if I'm looking at I want to see what equations they use to actually come up with carbon. People will sometimes play with the equations and pick the ones that favor the most carbon storage. I don't think that's the case. I think that they picked equations that are peer-reviewed, very well established, and even maybe a little conservative. Maybe there's a little bit more carbon on this project than they say. Not that it matters, because none of this carbon ever was at any risk, right? Finally, permanence. Now, obviously, nobody's cutting down any trees here, right? Like, this project has never been in any risk. Yeah, there's a couple red dots. Mostly that's noise. Maybe it's a tree that's fallen in the woods. So in that case, in that sense, the project is very secure. It's very permanent. But what I noticed here is, obviously looking at this deforestation over time, the river has really taken chunks out of the landscape. So let's look at the historical route of this river. If we go back to 1984, in this area, the river used to be very straight. And you can actually see down here, this meander was kind of cut off by the river later on. The river is starting to meander again, and this is not something that's happened very quickly, but this is a 30-year carbon project, and Vera claims that these credits are worth 100 years permanence. So in 30 to 100 years, what's going to happen with this river? Well, here's the river in 1998. Here's the river in 2000. So it's starting to bend towards the project. Here's the river in 2009. And here's the river today. So, in the course of the last 35 years, the river has gotten 1.5 kilometers closer to the project and already made its way a third of the way towards the edge of the project. What's going to happen in the next 30 years? Well, we know this river is capable of meandering up to 3 to 5 kilometers away from, its center line. I think it's entirely possible that, in the next 30 to 40 years, this river in some way transects the project. I don't know. So, maybe the carbon credits aren't even permanent. Maybe they're not simultaneously not real carbon credits, and they're also at risk of going into the atmosphere. So that's the situation in this project. It's despicable. I've never seen a Vera baseline that was so, made up. There's no precedent in the region for palm oil plantations of that size. Again, these are palm oil plantations right here. You can see the lighter shades. I don't see any precedent in the region for them being that size in an inaccessible area. I don't think that this Eco Lodge would sell very many Eco Lodge tickets if they cut their trees down. And so I think this project is entirely phony. And, part of the tragedy is, I've interacted with the Eco Lodge owners in a secondhand way. So I've known people who have talked to them a lot. And I think they're great people. And they bought this land thinking that they were preserving rainforest. I don't think that they necessarily have, but that's why they bought the land. And in their feeling is that they should get some sort of, payback for doing that. They bought this land decades ago. But that's not what these carbon credit systems are about. It's about preserving forest that was genuinely at risk at the time that the credits were issued. And, there's just no indication that that's the case. So, I'd love to go to the Eco Lodge, but I would never purchase credits from this project. And whoever has purchased credits from this project, really, they need to offset their emissions in another way because they haven't offset them here. All right. Well, that's all we've got to say for this project. Let's hope there's a truer one next time.